Thank you. I wanted to begin by taking issue with the idea that we need a British version of the First Amendment on the grounds that the First Amendment is actually just an American version of the English common law breach of the peace principle. And that's clear if you look at some of the First Amendment jurisprudence, such as Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, which established the Brandenburg test, which says the First Amendment doesn't permit a state to prescribe speech, even a speech advocating the use of force or the violation of a law, unless it's directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. Imminent lawless action, that's American for breach of the peace. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the First Amendment is an American translation of an English common law principle, since the first 10 amendments of the US Constitution are, broadly speaking, an attempt to incorporate the best of English common law, including the right to bear arms, into the American Constitution. So the question is, how can we best restore the common law breach of the peace principle? A British version of the First Amendment, as Tom says, as Nico has said, would certainly be preferable. It would be an improvement on where we are now. But is it the best solution to the problem? And I think not. I agree with Claire for a number of reasons. First of all, it would be a departure from the English common law principle that unless something is explicitly prohibited by law, it's permitted. That principle, as you can understand, is a great guarantor of our liberties. Unless it's explicitly prohibited by law, it's permitted. The First Amendment, to me, sounds more like it's in keeping with the Napoleonic Code, which is the opposite principle. Unless something is explicitly permitted, then it's prohibited. It would effectively be explicitly permitting speech. And I don't think we want to grant the state the right to permit us to have something we're born with and should have by natural right. Second, unlike in America, where, a point that Thomas made, where amending the Constitution is indeed a cumbersome process, and that means the First Amendment can be given a kind of status beyond the day-to-day battles of politics and a kind of longevity. We don't have that here. We have the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So even if we did pass a law incorporating a British version of the First Amendment into British law, it could simply be repealed by a successor parliament, which isn't much of a guarantee of free speech. Third, I think, and probably most importantly, it would require us to place our faith in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom as the ultimate custodians of free speech, and I'm just not very confident they do a good job. Frankly, I don't trust the upper echelons of our judiciary to discharge that duty. And judging from the capture of the lower echelons by radical progressive ideology, which sets very little store by free speech, I think things will only get worse over the next couple of decades. Do you really want to place the sacred trust of protecting our free speech to a group of judges pickled in gender identity ideology and critical race theory? Who's to say that Judge Melbourne Inman, who last week sentenced Lucy Connolly to 31 months in jail for an offensive tweet, won't ascend to the Supreme Court one day? Would you trust him to protect our free speech? One safeguard against the risk of bad justices who don't really care about free speech being appointed to the Supreme Court in the US is that they are appointed by the president and they enjoy life tenure, more or less. Here, Supreme Court justices are appointed by unelected officials, i.e. the blob. You might think that a British First Amendment could be so worded as to protect us from mischievous, woke Supreme Court justices who didn't care very much about free speech. But even if the wording was identical to the wording of the US First Amendment, and of course it would be bound to be a far more diluted version of it. But even if it was identical, that would be an inadequate safeguard against woke justices on the Supreme Court, because as Nico pointed out in his opening remarks, the First Amendment failed to protect free speech for 140 years after the First Amendment was made. And he gave various examples. I could give some more, but I don't think that's in debate. The First Amendment was only successful in protecting free speech in the 20th century and to a certain extent in the 21st century, thanks to right-minded Supreme Court justices being appointed to the court. So I think if we were to pass a British First Amendment, we would ultimately be at the mercy of our Supreme Court justices, just as the Americans are, and frankly, I don't trust them, particularly given how they're appointed. So what's the alternative? The answer, I think, is a great Free Speech Repeal Act, repealing all the laws that have restricted free speech, dating back, I think, to at least the 1965 Race Relations Act. There's your headline, by the way, if there are any undercover journalists here. Speaker at far-right conference says the rot started with the Race Relations Act. We have to strip away all these weeds to reveal the beautiful garden that is English common law. And what about the problem that Thomas has drawn attention to, that successor parliaments could, of course, reinstate those laws? Well, they could reinstate them. They could bring back legislation to bring back all those weeds, covering up the beautiful garden that is English common law. But that would require multiple acts of parliament instead of just the one it would take to repeal the British First Amendment. So let's not make it easy for them. Let's just repeal all those restrictions rather than introduce a law that could be repealed in one go by the next parliament. Thank you.